everybody. We're going to focus on trauma now, and I hope that it will become apparent why. You saw in the prior slide the examples of how trauma can be defined. Here is Wisner's definition of yet another level of trauma, symptoms of which, according to Pinder, Hughes, and Williams, are really products of decades or legacies of economic, political, and social isolation, lack of investment, loss of social capital, concentration of poverty, exposures to high risk, high levels of violence, displacement. We could go on and on about the things that actually create community trauma. It can be associated with place as well. We think of displacement, it can also be associated with place. And so think about for a minute last week's discussion about decolonization methodologies and decolonizing approaches. And you can start to see some links. Think back to the first week when we talked about the principles of CBPAR, and I think you will see a link. Think back to Evaluation 500 course and the 5 Rs, and you'll see a link. And I'm going to tie this together. So many of us have been thinking about trauma, and when we talk about trauma and when you look at trauma in the literature, unless you search community trauma or social trauma, you're going to get trauma at the individual or maybe family levels. Now, this is relevant, certainly, and in the readings, you're going to encounter additional definitions, and they'll align around sustained injuries and so on. But remember, it occurs at multiple levels. So think back to socio-ecological frameworks. Trauma is experienced at multiple levels, and they also interact and interwork and so on. Resilience too, but trauma also. So one of the challenges in understanding trauma is the historical penchant to blame the victims or the communities themselves or the families themselves. And this happens when we think too simplistically about trauma, or we fixate about it at the individual level, or we cease to remember that the address of trauma is going to rearrange power differentials and relationships, that there is actually something for all of us to do when we address trauma. This is also why public health, for example, something I've been in the field of forever, has a real hard time in the policy process, because it really does bump up against the rearrangement of power to set the conditions in which communities can be healthy. So when we think too simplistically about trauma, we risk weaponizing it, and understandings about it become weaponized with statements such as, well, what did you do? Versus, wow, what happened to you? Well, how did that happen? Versus, wow, tell me what you know about what happened. Tell me the situation, if even we have permission to learn. So why are we talking about trauma? Well, we're talking about trauma because if we are focused on change through community engaged and equity focused efforts, if we're hoping to orient our work as community-based and participatory action research, then we're required to interrogate power differentials. And of course, this part seems clear probably to you by now, but it follows logically, then there has to be trauma. There has been some trauma with this power differential. We live through a lot as people and communities, but there is trauma. So we know this is the case, but we don't know the extent. We know it's probably historical, social, and structural. So I'm going to tie this back to the principles of CBPAR, or CBPR, as our colleagues called it. The box is in brown with black writing. So it's the second box to the left on the top, the second 2 boxes on the left in the middle, and the second 2 boxes on the left and the bottom, if you can't quite see color well. Those are the ones that might immediately jump out at you as trauma relevant in terms of CBPR principles, and that's great. But I would submit to you that the spirit of CBPAR and the full participation of our partners rests upon an understanding of trauma at multiple levels, and our work must make space for it. So it's important to appreciate here that as evaluation researchers, we don't have to know trauma to appreciate it. It doesn't have to be my trauma for me to appreciate your trauma or a community's trauma. Having said this, you know, awareness of our presence as CBPAR oriented researchers, what that brings, and trauma linkages with that presence might also have an important role to play. And we need to parse that out with our partners. So community partners and advisors certainly can help us parse this out. So thinking about, again, relevances and how these things tie all together, I want to call your attention back to the 5 R's. And I'm going to post the Eval 500 5R video for those of you who did not have to suffer through my Evaluation 500 course on wicked problems. I hope it was a good one. But we focus on these signposts of engaged research to recognize the ecologies in which we actually do our work. And just as a reminder, you know, we're really grounded in relationship with our partners, relationship with these institutions. We have to have an awareness of those relationships and also what we bring. What relationships am I bringing by just virtue of having baggage with institutions I'm associated with as well. Responsibility, what is fair, right, and just in evaluation? What's propriety look like in this case? How relevant, how accurate, how meaningful is the work that we're doing? That our work needs to be focused on repairing harm and restoring loss. And that's even before we talk about trauma. And then, of course, resilience. And this is the capacity to withstand and recover from difficulties, which we know we all have, absolutely have. So let's think for a minute about trauma and why we're talking even about it here. What's a CBPAR-oriented researcher to do about trauma? Is there something to do about it? I submit to you that the answer is absolutely yes. Keep in mind that the responsibility about what to do is not just owned by you as a researcher. Pause for a minute, if you would, and write down a few ideas. What would you do? What should you do? Maybe you've done some of the readings already and you have some ideas. What could you do as a CBPAR-oriented researcher? And at what stage of the work could you do it? Is there only one place to do it? Is it at the study conception or the coalition development? Is it throughout? Is it when you evaluate the group and experience? So pause the slides and think about that for a moment and write some ideas down. So your reading will have additional advice, but as you think about the concept of trauma and wounds that don't heal, for example, let's use the surgical and health thing here. Let's use the image of wounds. So if you think about trauma and wounds that don't heal or don't heal well, you know, the scars we carry, the scar tissue, if you don't mind the metaphor, it can be debilitating, but it can also be a source of strength if space is provided to explore what that might mean in certain contexts. Remember, relevance, context dependent. Safe space. So think specifically about your positionality as researchers, the appropriateness of your work with specific committees, for example, and the ability you might have or opportunity to acknowledge and address trauma or in your collaborative research work. So think about the privilege offered to research and that we often lead even if we don't want to lead in these efforts. Here's a quick example. So you've all heard about the Drug Policy Research and Advocacy Board. I'm going to move over so you can read this here. Those boxes on the outside show you who are the members. So we have MOOD, medication for opioid use disorder, methadone, buprenorphine. We have providers, people on treatment, who in treatment, university researchers, harm reduction organizations, people with lived and living drug use experience who may or may not have had any relationship with treatment. So as you know, we formed the DPRAB to guide our study. And the study at this point was about federal regulations around buprenorphine and methadone treatment during COVID. It really is a lever for social change overall, but we needed to see who was implementing these changes and what the impact was. It was going really well. We've been working together for the last 2.5 years, going very, very well. We've already informed 2 areas of policy. One is our hepatitis C related studies from this group has really informed the change in Medicaid policy in our state. So they are dropping the pre-authorization requirement, and they're sustaining their support for sobriety. We're dropping the sobriety requirements. We have more to go, but 2 steps is better than no step at all. And of course, our findings that really, despite federal intent, no change was experienced is being discussed at the Office of National Drug Policy Control Policy at the White House, which is very, very important. We can actually try to get people here. But so despite the fact that this is going really well, you know, trauma informed, this process was not. That just sounded like Yoda, didn't it? Our process was not trauma informed. And we saw how this became an issue, our lack of being trauma informed, when we were interpreting provider survey findings that basically said, hey, despite federal intent, providers basically didn't do anything, make any changes. And what did we see in the dialogue in the Zoom, because this is a statewide group, in the Zoom, people on methadone and those with living and lived drug use experience were really in a place where there was so much to share and to say about those findings. And yet the dynamic emerging was really icky. You know, providers felt they had to find reasons to support themselves or call themselves out as different. So they had their own issues. And people who were on treatment and had lived with drug experience or were using at the time had their own experiences. And so we felt that dynamic, but we clearly hadn't planned for it. So a few notes about this, because I always like telling people how we do things wrong, because frankly, in research, nobody does. But I'm here to tell you that we do things wrong and we need to figure out ways to make them better. The good news is we are in relationship with our colleagues. It isn't just a one-off. And so we should have been intentional and we should have been thoughtful about trauma-informed practices when we established the coalition. And remember, we established this coalition collectively. People from the community with lived experience and living experience to me and said, hey, we got to solve this, blah, blah, blah. So together we did this. So it's not like this is Beth's idea. However, I had a lot of power in the process. It just deferred to me a ton. And we interrogate that together, but we also didn't interrogate this trauma-informed component together, but we did. And all is not lost, by the way. We regrouped and we are still regrouping because the DPRAB continues to do a lot of important work. And we're focusing on trauma now. Now, how are we doing that? We're identifying elements in our work together that have to be present in our coalition work to be trauma informed, to allow space to acknowledge trauma, safe space. And what does that mean? It means that we're building parallel processes into our intersecting process. So instead of everyone meeting together all the time, we're building parallel processes with intersection, allowing acknowledgement and discussion about how to address, and then how to build our process to be stronger. And this actually is being implemented in a second coalition that we're developing to reform methadone. We're writing an NIH grant that's due in March of this next year, and it's called MPACT. So it's really to normalize methadone treatment and create patient-empowered models collaboratively with patients and providers, and to test it together, et cetera. But to drive that car will be the coalition. And the DPRAB is going to be part of it, but they decided to do something. They wanted just methadone, people on methadone, to be really driving that themselves. And so that's great, terrific. But we are going to build in a trauma-informed process. We'll write about it, believe me, and we'll figure out how that looks. And we'll explore it together, and we'll constantly build in check-ins to see how is this going, how is it feeling. And the important thing I want to bring home here is that it's more than just about the research getting done. And I think you see this in the readings throughout, but I just want to hit that home. This is more than just the research getting done. We are doing something important with a community to meet their goals of change. And we're bringing in our research rigor as part of the tools of the process, but it's their lives, it's their communities, it's all of our collective experiences, and it's more than just the research getting done. So that's a piece here. The outcome, as I say, is to establish a parallel practice and to interrogate it continuously. And again, to share, hey, we're learning this. We didn't do this so well, but we've got this relationship and we all really do want to work together. So we're going to build this and see how it goes. So the final thing I want to share with you here is that I just want you to remember this work is a process. period. It is not a one-off. It is not a study that's over. It's a process. And you have to remember that. Stand firm also yourselves. If you're like, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, I don't have these experiences, stop. And go back to the 5 R's. What is this about? What are our watchwords? What are our signposts? What are the principles of CBPAR? I can learn how to practice those things. It's not just me, by the way. Have mercy for yourselves and for your collaborators. You know, we get up, we dust ourselves off, and we try again together. Why? Because we value each other and we have relationships with each other. One of the R's, right? We can do this. We can figure this out. The community has this knowledge to teach us what we have to be figuring out. And we're part of that community. And then I would say, use your privilege to advance social change. So in this case, my privilege is, you know, I'm the PI for that NIH grant if we get it. I get to say on paper, at least to the NIH, how this is going to look. That's my privilege. I can decide what that budget looks like and how these processes are funded. That's my privilege. Now, I do these things with collaborators. So think back to the week that we talked about how to measure, and we introduced the structural indicators for CBPAR instrument to you. But this is really important. How do I use my privilege in the process? So I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to your thoughts about what this means for you, what trauma means for you in this practice of being a CBPAR-oriented researcher, and how this ties together to decolonizing methodologies for you. What is resonating as principles of CBPAR that you're actually going to carry forward with you from here on? And what are the 5 R's that are helpful to guide you? These are tools for you. I don't expect you to leave this class and do all this stuff perfectly. No one does. And if the fact that you recognize that it is not perfect means that you're getting it perfectly. So I look forward to our conversations, and I look forward to our learning community discussions. Thanks for being on the journey with me.